Pakistan's geographical location in relation to the Himalayas and monsoon pathways makes the country acutely vulnerable to flooding. Increasing anthropogenic emissions have triggered an enhanced greenhouse effect, whereby the gases in the troposphere absorb longer wavelengths of radiation re-emitted by the Earth's surface, leading to warmer air temperatures. These higher temperatures have catalysed glacial outbursts from the Himalayan mountain range, increasing the volume of water into the Indus River basin and triggering flash floods. Furthermore, warmer air has a higher water capacity, resulting in an intensified monsoon season and increased annual rainfall. The severity of Pakistan's vulnerability to flooding was highlighted in 2022, when over a third of the nation was submerged by extreme monsoon rainfall, triggering the death of over 1,700 people and the displacement of over 8 million. Consequently, Pakistan has been increasingly vocal in global climate forums, demanding finance for adaptation schemes, particularly campaigning for increased contributions from larger emitters. However, this video will elucidate how Pakistan's climate policy tends to be driven by political decisions, with the government's priorities regarding national security and military power influencing both Pakistan's stance on flooding and the effectiveness of climate policies. Internationally, Pakistan has positioned itself as a key advocate for climate justice. As chair of the G77 conference at COP27, they led the effort to secure the Loss and Damage Fund, intending to mobilise funds from major emitters to help vulnerable nations recover after climate disasters. Pakistan's position at this conference aimed to highlight the material impacts that climate change can have, and was successful in achieving an initial commitment of over $230 million from developed nations. This achievement marked over a decade of pressure from developing nations, indicating that Pakistan's voice in these discussions catalysed a more just climate future by ensuring the project truly materialised. The establishment of the fund laid the groundwork for further mobilisation at COP28, with further pledges of over $700 million. However, official statements by Pakistani ministers have varied on this subject. While Kakar states that this is a welcome step to help vulnerable nations recover, Fakir notes that it's not really a victory yet, as funds have remained immobile relative to targets and the pledge at COP28 struggles to support developing countries. Pakistan's stance on flooding at recent COP meetings has been complemented by both national and transnational efforts to reduce vulnerability. Nationally, the 10 Billion Trees Initiative is a government reforestation scheme that aims to sequester atmospheric carbon and provide a natural defence to terrestrial flooding. The project promotes a community-based approach to reduce the flood extent and mitigate future change. However, as of COP28, there has only been 32% progress towards the target, indicating that the scheme needs to encourage grassroots participation in climate action. Regarding transnational interactions, Pakistan's position tends to be tied more closely to strategic economic partnerships than genuine climate allies. Through a national economic corridor, Chinese institutions provide financial support and security assurance amidst climate vulnerability and geopolitical tensions with India. However, this reliance on China means that Pakistan cannot support emission cuts which would undermine China's industrial interests. For example, at COP27, Pakistan took a passive stance on China's decision to phase down coal rather than phase out, and last year over $2 billion was directed from China to focus on coal production, directly contradicting climate pledges made with Pakistan, and indicating that Pakistan supports China in these diplomatic discussions with a growth-oriented mindset, as opposed to one that favours harmonious progress. This is further evidenced by Pakistan's cumulative conditional target, which pledged to reduce expected emissions by 20% before 2030 through reductions in fossil fuel usage. Although this target was ambitiously increased to 50% in 2022, the low levels of domestic green energy production and over-reliance on foreign energy supply resulted in the country quadrupling coal production following the Ukraine war, further suggesting that economic growth takes precedence over climate action. Pakistan's position on adaptation and mitigation for flooding is contingent upon both socio-economic and geopolitical conditions. With public debt amounting to 74% of GDP, Pakistan suffers from stagnating economic growth rates and a reliance on fiscal bailouts. Furthermore, agriculture in Pakistan employs 43% of the workforce, so the increase of flooding in line with climate change has destroyed livelihoods and forced the rate of poverty up to 37%, hindering large-scale climate initiatives as domestic funds remain immobile. This was seen with the creation of the National Disaster Management Authority, which aimed to improve transparency in the distribution of flood relief, but was only allocated 0.1% of the required funding, as finance was instead directed towards servicing debts and immediate recovery. This exemplifies how short-term needs derived from a struggling economy tend to override climate adaptation, and therefore the effectiveness of policies is limited by the inability to generate domestic funds to sustain projects. One of Pakistan's major barriers to effectively implement flood adaptation policies is mistrust at national levels, stalling cooperative efforts with geopolitical rivals. Kashmir's border with India is a hotspot of tension due to concerns over national security, with this conflict resulting in the rejection of transboundary early warning systems and increased flooding vulnerability for Pakistani populations. The rivalry also threatens to influence Pakistan's stance in global climate discussions. Despite pressuring India to reduce domestic emissions at climate forums, Pakistan has seen an increase in emissions of 14% since 2010, indicating that Pakistan's advocacy for increased obligations for larger emitters may be perceived as an effort to generate political leverage, as opposed to making a genuine climatic difference. Furthermore, the military power tied to Pakistan's precarious geopolitical position means policy tends to focus on national security, diverting finance away from climate action towards more political agendas. The military control of resources limits Pakistan's engagement with external actors regarding climate finance due to concerns over efficient distribution and corruption at federal levels. Accordingly, the USA has voiced its reluctance to provide climate finance to Pakistan, as it ranks in the top quartile for political corruption, as evidenced by the fact that less than a third of climate pledge finance for flood relief reached vulnerable communities. Despite recurring pledges at the previous two COP meetings to integrate the indigenous voice into policy, Pakistan faces issues relating to institutionalization and societal engagement, with federal decisions creating a disconnection between actors at varying scales. For example, Pakistan's national climate change policy has only accepted inputs from technical individuals, ignoring the voice of vulnerable sectors which require the most support when adapting to change. The consequent knowledge gap between the decision makers and the Pakistani public resulted in mistrust on the federal level, meaning progress on domestic adaptation has remained limited. Policies remain anchored in traditional development models which fail to account for differentiated vulnerabilities, leaving 63% of people in the poorest quintile to contend that government policy had not helped them cope with the impacts of flooding. Although efforts to redefine the climate framework have increased since the recent floods, emphasizing intersectional initiatives that recognize youth and female voices, the material effects of these have failed to arise due to concerns about the transparency of climate finance and patriarchal culture. Since COP28, youth-led ambitions such as Climate Forward Pakistan have been calling for increased governmental accountability and a more equitable distribution of climate finance, highlighting the need for a systematic restructuring. Furthermore, Pakistan's patriarchal society has resulted in a lack of gender mainstreaming in adaptation planning and finance allocation, leaving women marginalised and exacerbating their risk to the material effects of flooding. Although Climate Minister Sherry Rehman advocates for an approach that accounts for marginalised voices, rural women remain the most vulnerable, showing how the struggle of deeper cultural challenges indicate that genuine inclusion and progress depends on confronting the embedded status quo. Pakistan's stance can be critiqued relative to Bangladesh, a country which ranks similarly on the Climate Vulnerability Index and experiences an acute flood risk. Bangladesh is a pioneer of locally led adaptation and takes an intersectional lens to appreciate indigenous knowledge. Incorporating these very perspectives clearly augmented policy effectiveness, reducing the amount of economic flood damage by 81% since 2004. In contrast, Pakistan has only recently begun to incorporate indigenous voices into adaptation plans, but historical government action has undermined these efforts, allowing it to rank first on the Flood Risk Index. To conclude, while Pakistan has become increasingly vocal in climate discussions due to its increased vulnerability to flooding, this video has demonstrated how the effectiveness of adaptation policies and the country's position as a whole is heavily influenced by socioeconomic and geopolitical conditions. Flooding risk will remain a pressing issue for Pakistan, and current mitigation and adaptation efforts lag behind other developing countries as a result of political priorities. Therefore, a multi-scalar shift in perspective is required to prioritise cooperation and generate a sustainable source of climate finance, so that Pakistan can begin to achieve an equitable and effective climate future.